Hello and welcome to lecture number 29 of this series. The previous lecture was about so-called red florals. This one will be about so-called white florals. I think the white floral denomination has a little bit more of a legitimate claim to exist than the red one, because white flowers, that is to say flowers that rely more on their smell than on their color to attract pollinating insects, are actually a huge thing in perfumery, and they do have some things in common with some very specific aroma chemicals that differentiate them from each other, and somewhat unexpectedly. For example, and I hesitate to even say this because once I've said it and you've heard it, you can't unhear it, and it may damage your perception. The note that makes gardenia, which is, as I've said before, a really divine smell, the note that makes gardenia so special is actually a mushroom note. If you, next time you smell a gardenia, think of just champignons, just normal, Paris mushrooms as they're called, and you will see what I mean. And unfortunately, that tends to somewhat detract from the gorgeousness of gardenia to think that it's actually just white flowers plus mushroom. But anyway, and similarly, one of the character impact materials, meaning defining aroma chemicals of jasmine, is not the white flowers background accord. It's actually a celery note of jasmine. And again, once you smell it, it's very striking. But unless someone tells you, chances are you won't spontaneously notice it. So today is a real feast of naturals, because the first three materials I'm going to talk about are the three pillars of white flower fragrances, and they are actually natural extracts. The first one is Jasminum grandiflorum, which is mostly, I believe, comes from India, but there's some very good jasmine coming from Egypt and also from France. I don't know where this one comes from. Anyway, Jasmine grandiflorum, meaning big flowers. There's some outside here, actually, in Athens. Wow. Jasmine is a truly wonderful smell, and the extract does reproduce the smell of the flower. One thing about jasmine flowers is that they choose the time of day when they want to smell great, and it's usually in the evening. And this one has the wonderful sweetness and heaviness of jasmine. The odd thing is that actually among all this, floral smells, jasmine is really rather a chemical one. I mean, in the sense that the natural material feels heavy and almost actually benzenic, and we will come back to that in a second as to why that should be. Some grades of jasmine, the Mogra type jasmine that you find in India, have a green and almost lily of the valley top. This one does not. It tends to be bottom heavy. So if you're going to use this in a composition, you would probably need to freshen it up at the very top with some other types of jasmine, or indeed some other notes, maybe synthetics. But typically this would be used in combination with rose, because rose gives you that nice citrus aspect which freshens up of how can I put it? It's a beautiful smell, but it has a degree of trashiness about it, which I find, it is, of course, totally wonderful. There's nothing wrong with a trashy note. But if you can imagine a perfume entirely composed of this is complex enough to be a proper fragrance, but it would be a bit sort of lacking in sparkle. Now, I remember the best jasmine absolute I ever smelled was extracted by a friend of mine called Peter Wilde, who used a very low temperature method using freon, which is a refrigerating gas. So it was room temperature extraction with freon. Then you just boil off the freon very quickly, you recycle it, and you end up with Jasmine Absolute. And he did an extraction of Indian mogra, which is one particular type of jasmine. Mogra flowers smell fantastic. Fresh, green, jasmine. It's got all the different facets of jasmine all rolled up in one. And Peter Wilde's mogra extract was just spectacular, absolutely spectacular. So what happened was his process, which was clearly superior, was in fact so good that a very large fragrance firm wanted to specify his mogra Absolute for a major fragrance. And it was quite a battle to achieve that because, of course, all the technical perfumers in the major fragrance firm, they don't care if you show them one batch of mogra which smells insanely great. What they want to know is whether you can deliver that particular quality reliably, a particular quantity, for the following 10 years. Because if you're going to put that stuff in a major commercial fragrance, you don't want any bad surprises. So anyway, what happened was Peter Wilde's licensed the process to a firm who was extracting the mogra. And these people, I don't know what they were thinking. When they shipped the second batch of the mogra Absolute, they adulterated it. In other words, they threw in some cheaper jasmine, or I'm not sure what they did. I think it was probably just benzyl acetate that we'll come to in a minute. And basically, they sent a complete dud to the major fragrance firm. Now, that is so stupid. So stupid. Because, of course, the first thing that happens when a drum of something quite expensive, like mogra Absolute, arrives at the fragrance firm is the technical perfumers and the chemists immediately sample from the top, the middle, the bottom of the drum to make sure there's no layering, no funny stuff going on. They put it through a gas chromatograph, they put it through mass spec, they put it to their nose, and they know instantly that you've messed with them. And so the order was immediately cancelled. That company was struck off the list of suppliers, and it never happened again. Adulteration, basically either extending the amount, just putting in a bit of, synthetic just to make the volume bigger and so on. Those tricks don't work when you're dealing with professionals. But you still need an army of people to check. I have a friend who has a company in the south of France making perfumes. And she's been buying raw materials from local suppliers, many of whom she knows from going to school with them as a child. And she'd been buying dozens, maybe a couple of hundred raw materials locally in small quantities because it's a small farm. And one day she had the opportunity to do a full quality control. One of the big perfume houses said, okay, well, we'll just send us samples of every material that you put in your perfumes that you pay good money for, and we will do a proper quality control on each of them. It was out of 300 materials that she was using, something like 10 actually turned out to be what it said on the can. And the others were all adulterated in one way or another. So she'd been paying way over the odds for materials for years, maybe decades. Now, there are some suppliers for example, in Grasse, that are totally above suspicion. Laboratoire Monique Rémy would be one. They have made a living out of their stellar reputation for quality. Man is also very good. And I suspect the really big firms are not going to mess with you. But there's also a tremendous number of complete shysters in the industry who will sell you basically things that should be 10 times cheaper, all the while pretending that it is the real and wonderful thing. So the second material that I was smelling today is Ylang, which is often confused by people with jasmine because it's not a million miles away in smell, but it's a completely different plant. It's Cananga plant. And Ylang, let me smell it before I say anything. So Ylang, this particular grade, is very, very different from from jasmine. It has something in common. It has that heavy sort of benzyl acetate background, sort of oily, heavy flower. But it has a very different feel, especially at the top. It has a camphoraceous note, which is absent. It has a rooty note, which you don't find in jasmine. And it has quite a marked banana, or banana peel, actually, a bit of both, note up top, together with a green facet. So it's a bit more complicated, and absolutely beautiful, by the way. Going back to jasmine after that, yes, it's very familiar. Ylang has something more bite than jasmine. It's less bottom heavy and quite wonderful. Of course, a mixture of the two would be perfect. So today is Naturals Day, and the third one is tuberose absolute at 1%. I've seen tuberose concrète, which is the solid or semi-solid butter-like thing which contains a lot of waxes. The absolute has been cleaned up, and this is diluted. Now, it's funny. Tuberose is a deceptively simple thing, but it's actually very complex smell. I mean, at this concentration, this particular grade, having smelt the other two, smells very much like white flowers, but it has a potato. It has a freshly cut potato, sort of almost earthy note to it. It's interesting because historically there have been several absolutely memorable tuberose fragrances. I can think of two, Fracas by Piguet, which was composed by Germaine Cellier, which is a buttery, sweet, falsely innocent, huge pink sort of tuberose. And the first Oscar de la Renta fragrance was an absolutely massive tuberose, really wonderful. And you can see the tuberose extends, as the white flowers accord, with an extension downwards into the dry down notes, into a sort of a, if you have to think of it as orchestra. If the white flowers is woodwinds and brass, this dude has also some double basses thrown in. And it has an interesting bitter leather-like feel to it. You know when you smell this that you're going to basically use it in small amounts maybe, in every perfume composition, because it just has presence, it's got weight. So having smelt these marvels of nature, we now descend a few pegs in the great order of things to the majority component of certainly of jasmine, that's present I think in the other two, which is benzyl acetate. Benzyl acetate is an ester of benzyl alcohol and acetic acid. You can smell the jasmine as one thing, but you can also smell the parts. You smell a benzenic note and an acetic note, a vinegary note. The next material is jasmolactone. So we're dealing with what I mentioned earlier, the character impact materials, which are the celery note of jasmine. Now, Spiros Drosopoulos had originally used a different material. The impact material of real jasmine is cisjasmone, but that's not so easy to use because you have to dose it just right, otherwise the thing smells of celery, not jasmine. Jasmolactone is supposed to be easier. I don't have any particular point of view on this. This is a purely technical matter. Now, moving on to a completely different realm of white flowers. This is nerolidone. Nerolidone is a molecule which is clearly trying to sort of position itself within the sort of general orange tree, orange flower. Neroli is the extract of the leaves of the orange tree, but the leaves do smell a bit like the flower. This nerolidone, to me right now, smells surprisingly animalic. smell, together with clearly a white flowers, orange flower. Orange flower is very rich and sweet, and it has just a good balance between sweetness and acidity. I'm surprised actually that there is no actual neroli in this collection. I know that it's horribly expensive at the moment. For a long time it wasn't that expensive, and suddenly it was like people are going to have to make the orange flower effect from components, unless they want to spend a ton of money. The next material is called hivernal, and this is a perfectly good representative of a class of materials which are generally described as lily of the valley materials, and to call this a lily of the valley is just basically a joke. It's one of many cyclaminaldehyde, fluorhydral, even a molecule that I made called lyral. They are very useful to give a bit of bite to otherwise rather gentle lily of the valley accords. Like in the previous lecture, I mentioned lilitol, which was a delightful lily of the valley, and mannitol, they're both alcohols. You might want to add a little bit of this stuff just to give it a bite, but it is a metallic, aggressive smell. They're all fairly similar, all these lily of the valley so-called aldehydes. And now the final material today is a very famous raw material called hedione. Now, the story of hedione has become sort of a legend within perfumery, because it was discovered by a chemist at Firmenich called De Mol in the early 60s, if my memory serves me. It was, and is, a relatively speaking, weak, not particularly interesting, floral note, but without any definite orientation florally. I mean, you get floral, fruity, a little bit fruity, mostly floral. And again, it's one of those situations where if some chemist had come up to me as technical perfumer and said, "Oh, smell this stuff," I would have said, "Yeah, okay, so what? How cheap is it to make? Oh, it's expensive. Forget it." And that would have been a career-ending mistake, of course, because hedione is like iso-E super, one of those materials that, even though it has a rather nondescript and fairly boring and not that strong smell, works absolute miracles in compositions. Now, how did they discover that? I'm not 100% sure, but I think, from what I've heard, that the great perfumer Edmond Woodnitska had a part in it. He had a close collaboration with Firmenich, and maybe even directly with De Mol, the chemist, and he discovered, Woodnitska discovered, that this guy had an unreasonable effect on compositions. And the effect was to, so to speak, make them liquid. It just adds wetness and therefore naturalness. And so Woodnitska was working with this hedione, which at the time was majorly expensive. And he famously put some small amount in Eau Sauvage, which transformed masculine fragrance. Everybody fastened onto the success of Eau Sauvage as being due to hedione, and the demand for hedione became really strong. And the production ramped up over the next 20 years to the point where it became sufficiently cheap that you could put as much as 20-30% in a composition. And it's almost as if hedione has replaced what used to be the function of sandalwood oil, which is a solvent. What the hedione does is it sort of links everything in the formula in a transparent matrix. It sort of clears and joins up everything. All your materials that are flying in loose formation, suddenly whoop, they become joined up by hedione and given a mysterious and wonderful unity and freshness. And this thing is now a staple, and a cheap staple, of the fragrance industry.